Okay, so I would go further. A lot of parents find that this is, that they can seize a teachable moment. You guys know what I mean when I say a teachable moment? That's that moment where you're going along with your kid and there's an issue, something is said, a question is provoked or something like that. And it shines out like this bright and shining star. Here it is. It's an opportunity. And are you ready? Are you ready to seize it? Right? Literature gives you a wonderful occasion for these teachable moments. These teachable moments come up all the time in conversations about literature. But also, life gives you teachable moments when you're not doing literature. And if you've read a lot of stories, sometimes the literature that you have in common is it provides a wealth of figures to draw from, right? To talk about that thing that you're trying to teach in that moment, right? That is to say, in a lit class, we don't treat every story as though it were an ethical conversation, unless the work in question was written to discuss human ethics, right? We're going to treat the subject that's on the table that the author puts there on purpose, and to, pick out some marginal thing on the side that comes up that isn't central to the story is, not completely illegitimate, but certainly not central. It's like changing the subject on the author. Fair enough in a literature class. But once you've treated that story literarily in a lit class, you guys have that story and you have all of its contents. You have all of its characters there in your little storehouse that is memory. And so does your kid. And so imagine that you have read the Narnia stories. You've read the Chronicles of Narnia, all of you. And some time has passed. And one day, your child sells his siblings down the river, like sells them down the river. He acts like a traitor. And in your conversation with him, in order to drive home what he's done, you say, you acted an awful lot like Edmund in that story. Remember Edmund? Remember what he did? You're acting a lot like Edmund. And it comes to be real in his heart, right? He remembers Edmund. He remembers how provoked he was, how offended his sensibilities were by Edmund treating his siblings the way that he did. And he saw the end of Edmund and what all went on there. And that is a resource to draw upon, not so that he can learn how to read properly, but now that he's read that and he knows the story, that's a figure in his mind that you can always go back to. You guys, this is not unfamiliar to you. How many times have you been reading along in a novel or in an essay or whatever, and the author just alludes to a character in literature, right? Why? Well, maybe not to tell that story, but to import something of that character's personality into the story they're trying to tell. It just happened in our Pelican Book Club this last week. One of the characters was referred to as having a kind of Dorian Gray expression on his face. Well, if you've read the story of Dorian Gray, that really shades that character in that moment. You think, ooh, not a good guy, right? That guy's up to something and it's nefarious for sure, right? This is just illusion. I'm basically saying that there are two ways to treat literature. One is literarily in a literature class. But once you've done that, the mere fact that you've filled up the treasure house of the memory with these figures allows you in teachable moments to go into that storehouse and grab a figure and say, remember him? Let's talk about this. You see? And that is not doing violence to that story, because the story in that moment is not your object. The teachable moment is your object. Do you see that?
Absolutely.
Two totally different things.
And in response to one of Nicole's earlier chats, both of those conversations can actually happen at any time, including in the English class, as long as everyone's clear that those are two different kinds of conversations.
That you've left the literary conversation and you've gone on to ethics.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna maybe you're doing a treatment of the Chronicles of Narnia in class. And you want to talk about Eustace Scrubb, the boy with the name who almost deserves it, right? You want to talk about why he deserves that name. What is it that he is who is he, and what makes him tick, and why is Lewis spurning it? Why is he scorning it? Now you're going to delve into characterization, and you're going to isolate a character for a moment, and you're going to talk about what ethics this boy lacks, or what worldview has shaped him. And you're going to have a worldview conversation. And maybe that's not central to the actual plot of the story, but certainly does hinge on the plot of the story. Do you see that that's different than turning every single book into an ethics lesson? Because some books aren't actually written to discuss ethics. Some books are not. Every human character in a story, if they are well developed, are ethical or non-ethical in their behavior patterns. That's true. And certainly we can strip mine stories for ethics, and we can have an ethics class that hinges on literature, but that's not the same thing as reading for thematic ideas in a story, you see. So in lit class, sometimes when we see a teachable moment because the child is encountering an ethic that maybe he struggles with, maybe we say, okay, let's just put this lit class on hold for a minute and let's talk about ethics for a minute. I want to talk about this character and his ethic. And then you go back to a literary treatment, a thematic treatment of the story.
It's almost like the idea that you're arguing for here is inviting the author of a story, the artist of a particular work of art, into your class as a guest, and allowing him his say when it's time for him to talk, allowing him to talk about whatever he wants to talk about. And then, in addition to trying to understand his contribution to the conversation, being free to make your own contribution to the conversation. And if he were alive in the room and sitting at one end of the table, there would be no confusion about whose contribution was on the table at any one moment, right? If he was talking, it'd be his contribution. If one of your students was talking, it would be their contribution. What you're arguing for is keeping that distinction clear, even though the author is dead and all we have of his work is the book.
Think of it this way. You
First
get to the end of,
would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. You get to the end of the story and you say, we're going to write a theme on this paper. What you don't want is your kid writing a theme on what it is to be a good boy, the difference between Eustace Scrubb and a good boy, because that's not really the point of the story, right? When he's writing a theme, you want him to think thematically and talk about thematic ideas in the story itself. You want him to come alongside the author and expose his thematic game in the story, instead of changing the subject and saying, well, I'm just going to write a long treatise on how you ought to be, right? That's not literary, that's ethical. And ethics is another study. It gets its own course in college. It's certainly a legitimate course. It's just not the literature course, you see. If we turn every single story into an ethical discussion, then sometimes we miss the larger purpose of the author in the story. That's why we go on about that. Now, in the case of the Chronicles of Narnia, talking about Eustace Scrubb and thinking about him as an ethical creature and thinking about the worldview that shaped him is it's very important to the story itself, because unless we understand that, we don't understand what Lewis is contrasting, right? We can't really follow his storyline at all without understanding the character.
A key component of Lewis's themes in the Chronicle of Narnia is the ethical desperation of man, right? And in order for that to land in our hearts and minds with the proper weight, we have to be able to see Edmund as a scoundrel and know exactly why and in what ways.
Right.
That's an ethical conversation that Lewis fully supports.
And we have to see Eustace Scrubb as the product of a particular kind of education. Having read all the wrong books, he's totally ill-equipped to deal with real life and sin and things like that.
Right.
He needs saving, you see.